Hello and welcome to this Edexcel GCSE Geography topic overview. This one is looking at ecosystems, biodiversity and management. And remember, these are just a short review of the key information. It's not everything you need to know. You should really use these with your class notes, revision guides and any other revision notes to make sure you've got full understanding of all the elements of the topic. When you've had a look at this, have a go at producing your own or even make a video if you want to help with your revision. So first of all, always important, let's have a look at the specification. You can see it's split into three main parts. One is an overview of the different ecosystems. It's looking at how an ecosystem works, the different ecosystems and biomes within the world, and how it is an important system. We then look at the UK and the different ecosystems within the UK. We then move on to find out all about tropical rainforests, how they work, how the ecosystem works, and then why they're important, the problems and what can be done about it. And the same kind of thing for deciduous woodlands, which is really development of the UK ecosystems. So, looking at my mind map in its entirety, here you can see all of the different elements linked together. So we've got the overview, the UK systems, the tropical rainforest and the deciduous forest. So to start off with, we need to understand about the distribution and the key features of the main types of ecosystems around the globe. Now, what you'll see is I'll kind of set them up from how they range from the equator to the poles, and obviously this would be replicated on the other side of it. But it's very important to recognize the links between the distribution of ecosystems and weather and climate, and in particular the global atmospheric circulation cells. On the equator, where we have the low pressure, it's very hot and very wet, so we get tropical rainforests. Moving on from that, if we go to the descending air at the tropics, at the other end of the Hadley cell, we've got the deserts with the hot tropical conditions. And as the air flows from the tropics back to the equator, we can see it's still very hot, but we do get seasonal rain, so we get tropical grasslands. Not quite enough water for the rainforest. And this is replicated. The hot air goes up towards the temperate zones where we get temperate grasslands, and then where we get the meeting of the cold and warm air masses, so we get much more rainfall, we get the temperate forests. We then get the boreal forests further latitudes than that, where it's cold and wet with very cold climates, very cold winters. And then we have the tundra, which is sort of permafrost. The ground is permanently frozen, although temperatures can get above freezing. Now, it's also important to realise what are the different types of vegetation and the different types of animals you will get there. And in a moment, I'll put another slide up that you can pause where there's much greater detail on each of these different levels of ecosystem. It's also important to recognise that global ecosystems have a lot of value. One of the main ones the specification wants you to look at are something called provisioning services. Now, these are the things that we can actually get and take out of the ecosystem. Things like the foods, the medicines, the fuel, the building material, and all of that kind of information. But it's also important that ecosystems have a supporting service. When you look at the nutrient cycling and the water cycling, the ecosystems support themselves. So if you remove part of that ecosystem, the ecosystem collapses. Some ecosystems also have a regulating service. So things like the tropical rainforests are very important for controlling the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, which can then impact on climate change. So again, we can have to draw links between this and weather and climate. There is also the risk of global ecosystems of over-exploitation, of taking too much out of the ecosystem, in which case we're damaging the system and how it works. And we do this because we're trying to get industry, get resources for building things, the minerals that are involved in the rocks and soils, the gold, silver, aluminium, tin. But also we use it for energy. in different forms. We can use it for the water that's held within them. We also use the material not only for building material, but chopping them down to make more room for settlement and more room for farming as well. So that's the overview. And again, as promised, here is greater information on the different ecosystem zones, and you can see how they all link up pretty much in latitude zones. There are some exceptions, and again, these are caused by changes in the climate, like distance from oceans, prevailing winds, and altitude as well. But pause it now to have a look in more detail. We then look at the main UK ecosystems. So we're going to look at deciduous woodland in more detail later on, but we've got moorlands, which are the highlands, the hills and the mountains, and you can see some of the key features. There's high rainfall there. Much of the ancient woodland has been removed by humans over thousands of years, so now we tend to find heathers and brackens in these areas. Really, it's only good for things like sheep grazing or recreation or possibly forestry, and we might get animals like deer and foxes there. The heathlands, these tend to be the lowland areas without settlement on. Here we see drier conditions with heather and gorse, the main vegetation, with rabbits, reptiles, newts, frogs, that kind of thing living here. And again, the main use for it is really cattle grazing and recreation. So if you've been to places like Cannock Chase, that is a good example of a heathland. Another main one is wetlands. Obviously, these are the areas around rivers which are very wet. They tend to be low-lying. They have reeds and rushes, but many of them have been exploited and drained for farmland. Then we have the other main one. Because the UK is an island, it's the marine ecosystem. And the oceans and the coastline is very important for fishing, that we use for food. For energy, it's very important, particularly now more so with offshore wind farms, but in the past we've also exploited a lot of oil and gas, particularly from the North Sea. And we also use it for transport and industry. There is another system, the coniferous wood, which is another type of woodland, but this tends to be the fast growing. These aren't native UK species. Things like pine are very fast growing, so they've been very good for timber supplies. So let's have a look. Here's some more detail of the different UK ecosystems, so feel free to pause and take down more information from these. So let's look at tropical rainforest. Well, we need to understand their location. They are equatorial. Although they're called tropical, they are not on the tropics. Get that into your heads, please. They are found on and around the equator, places like South America, the Amazon in Brazil, Central Africa, the Congo, and Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Now the climate, they have perfect growing conditions. It's hot and very wet all year round with over 200 millimeters of rainfall. Because the conditions are very good for plant growth, there is high levels of biodiversity, lots of plants and animals. Because you've got a large number of plants, that's the bottom of the food chain, which means there can be lots of animals supported. You then need to understand the features of the tropical rainforest. So there is the structure, the emergence of the tallest, then we come down to the canopy, the undercanopy and the shrub. And the plants and animals have all adapted, and they have different adaptations to cope there. So the plants, they're surviving in these different stratified layers. Some of the trees have buttress roots to support them. The roots don't go down deep because the soils aren't very nutritious. So they have to have wide roots to support them. And the leaves have drip tips to get rid of the water so mold and algae doesn't grow on them and ruin the photosynthesis. For this specification, for the adaptations for animals, you've got to understand why they've got strong limbs for climbing, modified wings and beaks to be able to fly through the canopy, but also to access the nuts and seeds that are there. And also, many of the animals are camouflaged to prevent them from predators. It's also important to recognise the supporting services, how the ecosystem supports itself. And this is through the nutrient cycle. Now, ecosystems rely on biotic, the living things, the plants and animals, and the abiotic features. These are things such as the soil, the air, the sunlight, the climate, the water, etc. And it's important that you recognise about the food chain and how the plants are the primary producers, giving net primary productivity of biomass. But the nutrient cycle also links into the water cycle. And this can be shown by the nutrient cycle diagram here. B is biomass. This is the living plant matter, and most of the nutrients in the rainforest are in the living plants. When the leaves die, although they're deciduous, they drop their leaves all year, but because of the hot conditions, the litter breaks down very quickly and then goes back into the soil. But because the plants are growing so rapidly, they take it back up into the biomass. So this is why the litter and the soil stores are very small. Now we also need to look at the goods and services. And we need specific examples of the foods, the medicines and the timber, but also increasingly so for recreation and tourism. You also need to understand the threats. Deforestation, which is coming from population growth, more people needing more land, might be for settlement, also for resources to help grow the economic development of Brazil, and also for agriculture, whether that's cattle ranching or for cash crops such as soya plantations. There is also the threat in terms of climate change. As the climate changes, the rainforest may become drier, the rain falls less predictable, and it may also become hotter. Now this means the plants and animals, the adaptations they have, can't cope. And as the plants start to die out, then that means that the animals will start to die out as well. But there is some hope in forms of sustainable management. In the past, the governance has been very important in trying to give protected areas that can't be deforested. And it's recognizing the economic value of the ecosystem staying as it is. And ecotourism is a way of encouraging tourism, but is friendly to the environment. Now we can look at the deciduous forests, and again we try and compare these. Okay, the locations are temperate locations, places like your UK, Northern Europe, Northeast USA and New Zealand. The climate here is very different, linked to weather and climate, cooler winters, milder summers, rain all year but nowhere near as much as in the tropical rainforest. And because of these climate conditions, there's moderate biodiversity because the growth is much smaller in winter and it tends to be seasonal. Again, when we look at the adaptations, we can see that the plants, the trees, there are different stratified layers, again, same as in the rainforest. But the leaf size and structure is very different. These are all designed to capture as much water and as much sunlight as possible. But remember that the leaves are dropped in winter or before winter, so the frost doesn't damage them. And the animals, some of the adaptations there, some of them migrate to warmer areas, some sleep during the winter when it's too cold, and many of them, like squirrels, store food for the winter when the plants aren't there. Now the goods and services are very, very similar. Again, timber, fuel, but also conservation. Because we're a wealthier nation, we tend to be more concerned about looking after these resources rather than just exploiting them. The threat, deforestation. Now this occurred hundreds of years ago for agriculture, but there's still threats from things like population growth and settlement. Things like the high-speed train link could be damaging lots of valuable places. There are also the similar threats to climate change, changing the seasons, more storms blowing them down, and more floods and droughts. Again, the nutrient cycle is important, but here the biomass isn't as big, which means the litter layer, particularly in winter, can be much larger and the soil stores more of them. And it's also important to remember the sustainable management, the different things that can be done and the case studies there. So there we have everything for you. I hope you found it useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon. Bye.